The silence was the first thing I noticed, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that swallows all the familiar sounds of a home. For 20 years, this house had been a symphony of our life, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the distant drone of the pool pump, the creak of the third stair that he always promised to fix. But on that Tuesday afternoon, it was all gone, replaced by a void so profound it felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the axe to fall. He was standing by the grand floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room, the ones that overlooked the rose garden I'd spent 2 decades cultivating. He wasn't looking at the roses, though. He was looking at his reflection, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, the kind he got after closing a big deal. I'd always found it charming, a sign of his ambition. Now it looked grotesque, predatory. I had just come back from the charity luncheon, still in my pearls and a dress he once said made me look like a goddess. I put my purse down on the marble island in the kitchen, the soft thud echoing unnaturally in the stillness. He didn't turn around, he just spoke to my reflection in the glass, a coward's move. He said he was leaving me. He said he'd found someone who made him feel alive, someone vibrant and young, not someone who was, in his words, coasting towards the inevitable decay of middle age. He used that exact phrase, inevitable decay. It was clinical, cruel, and so utterly detached that for a moment I thought it was a joke, a horribly unfunny prank. But then a girl, who couldn't have been much older than our niece, slinked out from the master bedroom. She was wearing one of my silk robes, the one I reserved for special occasions. It hung off her bony frame, a parody of the womanhood she was trying so desperately to project. She had the bright, vapid smile of someone who had never known a single day of hardship, a life purchased and paid for by others. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder, and stared at me with a look of triumphant pity. That was when the floor fell out from beneath me. The 20 years we had built, the laughter, the tears, the late-night conversations, the shared dreams of growing old on our porch, all of it evaporated in an instant, a mirage I had mistaken for an oasis. He finally turned to face me, his eyes cold and devoid of any of the warmth I had known. He told me the house was sold. He told me the accounts were frozen. He told me that since I hadn't worked a day since we were married, I had no claim to what he had earned. He presented me with divorce papers already signed by him and a check for what he magnanimously called a generous severance. It was enough to cover a few months' rent in a cheap apartment, a pittance, an insult designed to underscore my utter dependence on him. He informed me that the new owners would be taking possession at the end of the week and that I should pack a bag with my personal belongings and be gone. His new life, he explained, required a clean slate. I was the old slate, cracked and dusty, ready to be discarded. I looked around the home I had created. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every book on the shelves I had chosen with love and care. I had overseen the renovations, managed the staff, hosted the dinner parties that furthered his career, raised our children who were now grown and gone, and I had done it all as his partner, or so I had thought. Now I was being told that my contribution was worthless, that my 2 decades of unpaid, unrecognized labor as a wife, mother, and hostess meant nothing. He saw me only as an expense, a line item on a budget that he had now decided to cut. The girl giggled, a high-pitched, grating sound, as she ran her hand over the back of my favorite armchair. "I just love what you've done with the place," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "but I think we'll be changing everything. We need something a bit more modern." I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. A strange and terrifying calm washed over me. I felt like I was watching a movie of someone else's life imploding. I simply nodded, my body moving on autopilot. I went upstairs to our bedroom, the room where we had shared our most intimate moments, and found her clothes strewn across the bed, her cheap, synthetic perfume choking the air that used to smell of my lavender potpourri. I packed a single suitcase. I took my clothes, my toiletries, and a small, unassuming locked box from the back of my closet, the one he had always dismissed as my little box of trinkets. He didn't even watch me leave. He was too busy showing his new toy, the wine cellar, explaining the vintage of each bottle I had so carefully selected over the years. As I walked out the front door, the door I had walked through as a hopeful bride 20 years ago, I didn't look back. The man I had loved, or the man I thought I had loved, was a stranger, and he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He thought he was leaving me with nothing. He thought he was the king of the castle he had just sold out from under me. He had no idea that for 20 years I hadn't just been cultivating roses and hosting parties. I had been the architect of the entire kingdom, and I held the original deeds. He saw a discarded wife. He should have seen a silent CEO. His generous severance check sat on the passenger seat of my modest car, the one he insisted I drive because it was sensible. I picked it up, and for the first time that day, I smiled. I tore it into 4 perfect squares and let the pieces flutter out of the window like confetti as I drove away. The war had just been declared, but he didn't even know he was a soldier, let alone that he had already lost. He thought he was starting a new chapter, but he was just a character in the final one I was about to write. The first few days were a blur of cheap motel rooms and lukewarm coffee. The anonymity was a strange comfort. In the world I had left behind, I was a recognizable figure, the wife of a man whose success was the talk of our social circle. Here I was nobody, just another woman with a story in her eyes. The shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear rage that was as sharp and hard as a diamond. It was a fuel I hadn't felt in years, a fire I thought had long been extinguished by the comfortable monotony of a privileged life. My husband, or ex-husband as he was now, had made one critical, arrogant mistake. He underestimated me. He, like everyone else, saw only the carefully constructed facade, the gracious hostess, the supportive wife, the woman whose biggest daily decision was the dinner menu. He never once in 20 years bothered to look deeper. He never asked about my life before him. He never wondered what was in my little box of trinkets. He was a man so consumed by his own reflection that he couldn't conceive of anyone else having a substance of their own. My father was not a wealthy man, but he was a brilliant one. He was a quiet, unassuming accountant who saw the world in numbers and patterns. He didn't trust banks and he didn't trust the whims of the stock market, but he believed devoutly in tangible assets and the power of compound interest. When he passed away, he didn't leave me much in the way of cash, a fact my husband had noted with some disappointment. What he left me was a portfolio of knowledge and a small, initial investment in a series of anonymous holding companies he had set up decades prior. Never let a man be your entire financial plan, my father had told me a week before my wedding. Love is wonderful, but ownership is better. I had taken his words to heart. While my husband was busy building his career, I was quietly, meticulously building an empire in the shadows. When he wanted to buy our first home, I let him take out the mortgage in his name. What he didn't know was that 3 months later, one of my holding companies bought that mortgage from the bank. Every mortgage payment he made, every cent of interest, was paid directly to me. When his business started to take off, he needed capital to expand. He was furious when the banks turned him down. Then, a miracle happened. A silent investment firm from overseas swooped in, offering him a generous line of credit with surprisingly favorable terms. He bragged for weeks about his shrewd negotiating skills. He never bothered to read the fine print to trace the labyrinthine path of ownership of that firm. If he had, he would have found it led directly back to me. He thought he owned his company. In reality, he was a glorified manager in a business I held a majority stake in. And the house, the grand mansion he had just sold to new owners, those new owners were another one of my corporations. He had signed the deed of sale over to me for a price that was insultingly below market value, a final act of financial dominance, he thought. He had laughed about it on the phone with his lawyer, how he'd managed to get it done so quickly, how his foolish wife would never know. I listened to the recording of that call, provided by the private investigator I had on retainer for the last 6 months, and felt a chilling sense of vindication. He wasn't just a cheat, he was a fool, a preening, arrogant fool. In that motel room with the flickering neon sign outside casting long shadows on the wall, I opened the locked box. It didn't contain trinkets. It contained hard drives, ledgers, original deeds, and stock certificates. It contained 20 years of my secret life. I spent the next week on the phone. My voice was calm, my instructions precise. I spoke to my legal team, a group of sharp, ruthless women who had been on my payroll for years, waiting for this exact moment. I spoke to my financial advisors. I systematically began to dismantle the world he thought was his. First, I called the loan on his business. With the stroke of a pen, the silent investment firm demanded immediate and full repayment of the capital he had been using for years. I knew he didn't have the liquidity. His entire net worth was a house of cards built on the illusion of ownership, and I was about to pull out the bottom card. Next, I initiated foreclosure proceedings on his personal debt, the credit lines he had used to buy his sports cars, his watches, and the gaudy jewelry he had undoubtedly gifted to his new pet. Every luxury he had surrounded himself with was financed by debt that I owned. Finally, the house. My lawyers sent an eviction notice to him and his paramour. It gave them 48 hours to vacate the property that now legally and irrevocably belonged to my corporation. I could only imagine his confusion, his sputtering rage as he received the official, legally binding documents. He would have called his lawyer, screaming, only to be told that the contracts were ironclad. He would have tried to access his bank accounts, only to find them frozen, subject to the liens I had placed on them. He thought he had left me destitute. He was about to discover what true destitution felt like. His downfall would not be a quiet affair. I made sure of it. I leaked the details of his company's sudden financial collapse to the business journals. I made sure our entire social circle knew that he was being evicted from the home he had so proudly claimed as his own. The narrative I spun was one of a reckless businessman whose empire had crumbled overnight due to his own hubris and mismanagement. There was no mention of me. To the world, I was still the poor abandoned wife, a victim of his spectacular failure. It was the perfect cover. Let him be destroyed by his own ego. The final piece of my plan was the most personal. I waited until the day of the eviction. I knew he would be there, a cornered animal lashing out at the movers, at his weeping girlfriend, at the world. I didn't go myself. That would have been too crude. Instead, I arranged for a single, final delivery. The delivery truck that pulled up to the curb of what was once our home was nondescript, a plain white van. The men who got out were not movers, they were couriers. They carried a single, large, flat-screen television and a stand. Under the watchful eye of the sheriff overseeing the eviction, they set it up on the manicured front lawn facing the house. They plugged it into a portable generator and left. Then the screen flickered to life. I wasn't there to see it, but I had a live feed from a discreet camera placed across the street. I watched it all from the comfort of the presidential suite of a five-star hotel, a glass of vintage champagne in my hand. The screen showed a montage, a carefully edited story of our life. It started with our wedding day, me looking up at him with such trust and adoration. It moved through the birth of our children, family holidays, anniversary dinners. It was the perfect picture of a perfect life, the very image he had so carefully curated for the world. Then the tone shifted. The happy music faded, replaced by a cold, quiet narration. My voice, I recounted in excruciating detail the financial architecture of our lives. I showed scanned copies of the documents from my box of trinkets. The deed to the house registered to my holding company a month after we bought it, the paperwork showing my acquisition of his mortgage. The majority share certificates for his business, held by my overseas investment firm. With each revelation, the camera zoomed in on his signature, a testament to his lazy inattention to the details he considered women's work. The video was my masterpiece, a 20-year-long game of chess where he never even realized he was a player. I laid it all bare. The final segment of the video was footage from the private investigator. It showed him with his young mistress, laughing in expensive restaurants, sneaking into hotels, all time-stamped. It showed him at his lawyer's office, crowing about the pittance he was leaving me, how he had sold his house from under me. The camera on the lawn caught his reaction perfectly. His face, already contorted with the rage of eviction, turned pale with disbelief, then purple with apoplectic fury. The girl beside him, who had been crying about her designer shoes being put in a cardboard box, stared at the screen, her jaw slack. Her expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror as she realized the powerful, wealthy man she had attached herself to was a fraud. He was not just broke, he was a fool, exposed and humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. He started screaming, a raw, animalistic sound of a man who had lost everything and finally understood how. He tried to attack the television, but the sheriff's deputies restrained him. His final shred of dignity was stripped away as he was placed in the back of a squad car for causing a public disturbance. The girl simply turned, hailed a cab, and disappeared from his life as quickly as she had entered it. She had signed on for a life of luxury, not a public spectacle of failure. I turned off the feed. I finished my champagne. I did not feel a rush of victory or even satisfaction. I felt a quiet, profound sense of release. It was the feeling of a heavy weight, one I had been carrying for 2 decades, finally being lifted from my shoulders. The man was gone. The lie of our marriage was gone. The woman I had pretended to be was gone. In the weeks that followed, his ruin was absolute. His business was dissolved, its assets absorbed by my company. His reputation was shattered. Our former friends, who had initially offered me their syrupy condolences, were now silent, stunned by the truth. I never spoke to him again. My lawyers handled everything. I sold the house. It held too many memories, both good and bad, and I was only interested in the future. With the immense capital I now fully controlled, I started a foundation dedicated to providing financial literacy education for women, a tribute to the lessons my father had taught me. I traveled the world not as a tourist staying in resorts, but as an explorer, finding joy in my own company, making my own decisions, living a life that was authentically mine for the first time. He had intended to erase me, to reduce my 20 years of life into a single generous check. Instead, he had liberated me. He had stripped away the gilded cage and forced me to remember the woman I was before I met him, strong, intelligent, and fiercely independent. He thought he was taking everything from me, but he only took what I had been willing to let him think he had in the first place. He was a footnote in my story, while I was the author of his entire downfall. Thanks listening this story. Now I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. Share this story with your friends and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Revenge Laura for more episodes.